Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And let's begin. We today are starting a new passage in the Torah. We're going to be concluding the book of Exodus, the book of Shemos. And that is in your Chumash on page 385. And that's chapter 38, verse 21. So chapter 38, verse 21 begins this week. The discussion around the account, it starts off with the accounting given after the collection for the building of this sanctuary, of the tabernacle. And then it goes into detail about the building of the making of the garments for the priests. And then it describes, finally, beginning in chapter 40, on page 389, the erection of the actual Mishkan, as well as the bringing in of the vessels, and finally, in the very last verses of Parshas Pekudei and really the book of Shemos, the book of Exodus, it describes the moment at which Moshe, or which God rather, enters the sanctuary, the holy place. I think this is, first of all, a fascinating story, even though it's interesting in its details only to architects. But the endeavor of the human being to create a sanctuary for God, to create a sacred place, is I think what we are doing here on earth. Jewish teaching is all about the sanctuary. You know, we think about, in general, we think about spirituality, religion, as being the human being's endeavor to reach beyond the human experience into the sacred, into the divine, right? So you want to escape from the confines of the human experience and have some transcendent spiritual experience, right? That's, I think, what we think about when we talk about spirituality. Yes? A person wants to have an experience of God, right? That's what, or call it whatever you will. If you want to talk about an experience of connectedness with the universe, or an experience of the transcendent otherness, or an experience of sublimination, or of a connection with the sublime, right? All these things, they're all an experience of the other. It's about leaving the confines of myself and being and touching something beyond my normal experience. And that, I think, is the pursuit of spirituality in the classic sense. And this really turns that on its head, right? Rather than talking about reaching outside of the experience to touch God, or whatever you call it, we're talking about bringing God into this earth, carving out a space for God in the human experience. And I think that's the remarkable and unique approach that Torah has, that Jewish teaching has. Yeah? Meaning, when you think about it, we in Jewish teaching is all about.
I don't know if that's unique. I mean, what about all the religious statues and in other religions?
So I think that when we talk about religious iconography and religious spaces, they are an homage to something beyond. They're something other, meaning all of those things are ultimately a uh, meant to be a muse by which a person can reach outside, right? It's something to help me. It's a key to leaving where I am.
I thought the notion of Jews being wary of idolatry,
Right.
that idolatry meant investing a statue
Ah,
in more than just the stuff that it's made out of.
that's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. So, what's the difference between idolatry and what we're talking about? Um, so, if we talk about, if really, we look at Maimonides and how he describes the history of idolatry. So, Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah, Rambam, in the laws of Avodah Zarah, in the laws regarding the prohibition of idol worship, talks about the history of idol worship. And he says at first, everyone knew that uh, God was the creator of heaven and earth and was running the world at all times. And then at some point, people began to appreciate God's servants, the sun and the moon and the stars, etc., and began to honor them as God's servants. And then ultimately, they began to forget God and began to isolate the servant from God. So, the perhaps the issue with idol worship, and we have to really work through this idea a little bit, is that we're talking about with idol worship something that is separate from it. There is we're looking at a power rather than uh, connected to the all, right? So I'll give an example. We so going back sort of in ancient classic idolatry. So you have the fertility gods, or you have the weather gods, right? They are all those are expressions of God, and we pray to God too for the weather, and we recognize the divine hand that is in the weather. After all, when we talk about, let's say, we recently described the Exodus from Egypt and the story of the Israelites experiencing and the Egyptians experiencing the 10 plagues, right? That is the hand of God in weather, right, and in natural occurrences. And so, what's the difference between praying to the weather gods or the fertility gods than praying to God for the weather or the fertility? And I think that the problem with that is one of them is that it identifies an individual power of weather, an individual power of fertility, and we're praying to the forces of weather or fertility itself, and disconnecting it from a larger sense of purpose, and disconnecting it from a larger, more transcendent narrative for the whole universe. And then when we go into um, into this dichotomy between God being everywhere and being able to have a space for God in this place, I think that's the point that you raise is very important here, because it really identifies that when we carve out a space for God in Jewish thought, God is not confined to this space, but that we are accessing that which is transcendent and everywhere, but in my world, in my space. Now, so I'll just step for a moment into this large philosophical question. The Greeks talked about The Greeks talked about the difference between the logos and the cosmos, and the idea of God being in things, or the God being a transcendent idea. Um, and I think this question, so why is it? Why do we think of God as transcendent? Right? It's because we have the notion of God being unlimited, right? And if God is unlimited, then it would be inappropriate to refer to God as being in things. At the same time, though, if we take the notion of unlimitedness to a more extreme expression, that would then mean that to say that God can't be in things is to limit God, right? But then, at the same time, we've been talking over the last couple of weeks about the idea that creation is about the beginning of specificity, right? The framework of creation is all about the introduction of specificity, whereas before creation there is only everything. Before creation there is only potential, and before potential there's really the possibility of potential, right? That's even higher. Um, and then, when we talk in the story of creation, we talk about the great deep, or the watery mass that precedes the formation of the world. And the formation of the world is just increasing specificity and detail and rules, really, right? So we have to remember in all of this discussion that there is kind of a tension between what we refer to as God, which transcends specificity and at the same time creates specificity, and the human experience, which is through specificity. Okay? So, the Mishkan, the tabernacle, is the way in which we experience God through specificity in the human experience, not saying that God can be specific, not saying that this thing is God. When we say that there is a divine power in Jewish thought, we are connecting it to the transcendent, to the divine, to the all-encompassing narrative of the universe. And so this is also very important, which is the difference, the reason why idolatry is so dangerous, and the way in which it manifests still today. Meaning, we have to remember that people don't change. At least I don't think that people change. I think that by and large, the tendencies that humans have had throughout history, we still have today. And they may be acculturated to some degree, but those tendencies are still latent. So, the danger of the idolatry is that it places my relationship with my environment outside of a greater narrative. Idolatry is, in a sense, the most selfish kind of worship possible. It's, in a sense, worship is supposed to be about going outside of myself. And I know that I said before that Judaism says we should bring God into our experience. But remember, even though it seems like the opposite, it's actually, it seems counterintuitive, but it's actually consistent. I'll try and follow the thought through. In a sense, the worship of a God, for the power it represents in my life, is not the worship of the God, but a worship of my own desire. It's getting what I want from the divine power. And therefore, I will be seeming to reach outside of my experience into the divine power, because I think that that's where I will achieve fulfillment and will realize the desires of my heart. But when rather I don't worship in order to fulfill my desires, but I worship because I'm trying to connect myself and place myself within a greater narrative of the universe,
Excuse me.
then it is most fitting that I should find God in my own experience. Yeah? No. I feel like I lost you. No, come on. You got lost there. No, come on.
I don't know why.
Yeah, it's okay. I might be a little lost myself. If I am, if my worship, if the purpose of my worship, from the idolatry point of view, let's say, I'm worshiping the fertility god because I want to have fertility. I'm worshiping the weather god because I want to be safe, or because I want my crops to grow, right? I will be reaching outside of my experience because I feel powerless, and I realize that the true power is going to be outside of me. But the purpose is to serve me. It's so that I would have my crops, and so that I would have my whatever it is that I want, right? So it seems like I'm reaching outside the experience, but ultimately it's to fulfill me. If, on the other hand, my purpose is to find myself, to place myself in the greater narrative of the universe, something that is outside of me, then it requires me to find God, to find that narrative in the specificity of my experience. I have to identify what is the puzzle piece that I live in. And I have to find God in that puzzle piece. Finding God in that puzzle piece places me into the puzzle and fits me into the greater narrative of the universe. And so, in a sense, finding God in the specific details of my experience is connecting me to the transcendent, is an expression of my awareness that God is transcendent and that there's a greater narrative of the universe that I have to submit to. So you hear the counterintuitive, the inverse kind of thing?
Sounds like I don't get the whole gist of your argument, but I do feel certain parts of it that it's a slippery line between being selfish in your prayer and being expansive and appreciative of understanding of God's presence in the universe.
I'll put it to you this way.
Versus fulfilling my own needs through
Right.
these powers.
So you can be doing the
And
same thing.
sometimes in prayer,
Yeah.
I mean, you read these phrases. If you will obey my rules, then I will bring you
Right.
sunshine, and I will bring you what you want. I'll bring you the crops will grow, and
Right.
you see a lot of those
Yes.
things that almost step across the line.
Mm-hmm. Right. So so the
That's part.
yeah.
of
So
it,
that's that's true. The Bible is full of these references, and we say them in our prayers as well.
Yeah.
That if you'll observe the mitzvahs, then you'll be blessed.
Yes.
Right. I think that first of all, two people could be doing the exact same thing
Mm-hmm.
in their worship. It can seem to be the same thing, but actually it's exactly the opposite.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Meaning, two people can be praying about their lives,
Mm-hmm.
and one of them it's to serve the self,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is because it fills it feeds their larger sense of purpose. And purpose is, in the Jewish sense, is going to be something outside of me. Purpose is not about, the purpose won't be the concept, the consummation of self, it'll be the transcendence of self, right? It won't be about fulfilling myself and making myself better. It's about making myself better so that I can perpetuate the narrative, I can perpetuate the destiny of all people, of the human, of the world as a whole. Right? This is the messianic idea of Judaism, which is that the society, that the world has a destiny. The destiny is to realize um, spiritual enlightenment, and through that to bring harmony between heaven and earth, body and soul, and a correct relationship with God. And each of us help to manifest that by our own perfection, by our own self-perfection. So the perfection of self is actually there to manifest something which is beyond me, which is greater than me, which I may not ever achieve, but I will have participated in making.
Can I say it in different words? And
Yeah.
Yeah,
please.
The universe is a mesh, and the highest form is for me to fit myself into the mesh. I take myself and fit it into the big puzzle,
Right.
the mesh. It's not me finding gratification to pray and feel that it is only for me. This world is made for me. The world is created for us, with all the powers and all the possibilities and all the creation, and we are just a drop in, and that drop is important, and we fit ourselves into it. Would that be correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's true, though, that this will also come along with it a sense of well-being, hopefully, right? And being blessed, right? Come along with that. But yes, our purpose is to correctly fit ourselves into this great puzzle, and this long-standing, this ongoing narrative. We have to play our part correctly.
And we have to have the right attitude
Right.
in order to be part of the universe.
So I would argue that, just to take what you said just a step further, not only do we have to have the right attitude in order to, but part of fitting ourselves in the puzzle is having the correct thoughts.
Right.
Right? So
Definitely.
our thoughts are also a place in which we fit ourselves into the universe. So doing that requires that we carve out space for the divine in our world. That we carve out space, that we carve out time, awareness that God is present in our universe, in our world. And so in the larger sense of Jewish teaching, everything that we do as a Jew, following the Torah, is going to be about manifesting that idea. So Torah, so an example, there are 613 mitzvahs, right? There's 613 divine ordinations. Ordinations? Is that a word? Cindy, is that a word?
Ordinances?
Ordinances. That's the word I was looking for. Thank you. Or actually, so as an aside, the word mitzvah is better translated as to enjoin. Did I ever tell you this one before?
Enjoy?
To enjoin. Right.
It's an order also.
And so enjoin means to order someone to do something, right? But it also has that etymological reference to the idea of joining, connecting. And the word mitzvah represents those two ideas as tzivui, commandment, and tzavta, connection, binding, grouping. So I just think that, so we have to find, what is the plural of the word to enjoin? What is the you have to translate the word, the verb enjoin, into a noun and then pluralize it. Can that be done? I don't know. Where are my grammar experts? Enjoinments.
Enjoyment, that sounds good.
Enjoinings.
Enjoinings. Good.
Enjoy.
So there. Where was I? 613 mitzvahs. There's 613 opportunities for connection with Hashem. The rabbis divide the 613 mitzvahs. By the way, interesting. Everyone agrees that there are 613 mitzvahs, but there is some discussion about what exactly those 613 mitzvahs are. It's interesting, right? You would think that it would be the other way around, that everyone knows what Jews have to do, right? The question is, should we count it as 613, 614, 615? This mitzvah might be 2, this mitzvah. No. There's an authentic Jewish tradition that's undisputed, going back to the beginning of Judaism, that there are 613 mitzvahs. And then there's discussion about whether, an example of a dispute of whether the mitzvah of teshuvah, of somebody returning from sin, is considered a mitzvah. Right? It's a question whether it should be considered a mitzvah or not. Is it a mitzvah for itself, or is it simply the notion of returning to mitzvah? Okay? Right. So there's all this philosophical discussions about this, which is very interesting. The rabbis divide the 613 mitzvahs, this too is undisputed, into 248 thou shalts and 365 thou shalt nots. Okay? What is significant about the 365 and 248? So the 365 right away brings to mind for us what? 365 days of the year. And the 248 is in ancient Jewish medicine, the body parts were divided into 248. There were 248 limbs and 365 sinews. Okay, this is the
Kabbalah.
it's even in the revealed Torah, meaning it's even referred to in the Talmud, etc. So yes, but certainly Kabbalah gives us a much deeper understanding of what this means. What is this? What is the messaging here when we talk about this? Remember, everyone agrees that there are 248 and 365. This number, this form, is important because everyone understands that there is a message here that's inherent to the essence of what Torah is, and that is that it's about bringing about the expression of the relationship with God in every day, in every moment of time, and in every part of my physical being.
At the same time, if we have pain in a part of the body, it means that we are lacking in a particular commandment that is hitting us negatively.
So there's certainly a work to be done along those lines, identifying meditations or healing, spiritual healing, I would say not spiritual healing, but religious healing, through, in addition to traditional medicine, through thinking about if I'm not well in part of my body, can I heal that through a mitzvah?
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's certainly there's a whole school of thought around that.
An acupuncturist who is Korean,
Yeah.
and he lived in Israel for 2 years in the university, and for something else he came. And he says that he really believes that each part of our body has something to do with our behavior. And he says the word mitzvah, which does not have in any other religion these particular words. It's true, some people call it a good deed, but it's not. It doesn't equate. And I was flabbergasted to hear that he really believes it. He's besides being acupuncturist, he's also minister.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated.
Yeah, it is very interesting.
Fascinating.
Right. So the general idea of Judaism as a whole, of the Jewish project, let's call it, which is expressed and embodied in the Torah, is that we would express our relationship with God, or the presence of God, manifest the presence of God in every moment in time and every aspect of our being, right? And so the Mishkan is the great symbol of that. And that's why it's so important. We spend so much time on it and so many references to the details. So the Mishkan is the bringing of the presence of God into the physical space, which is sort of emblematic of everything that we're doing in this Jewish project. The bringing of God into the physical, into the human experience. Okay, so then we have to look at what is the message of the specifics of how the Mishkan story is told, and what is the message for us in our work, in our endeavor to carve out the space, to carve out space for the divine in the human experience. On a deeper level, you might say, to peel away the concealment that conceals the presence of God that is already here. So, first of all, the idea that the scripture seems to refer to the similar language in the description of the Mishkan as in the creation of the world. If you look, let's look at page 388, verse 39-32, chapter 39, verse 32. Or you know what? Let's even go back. Let's look at verse 43. I think it's more clear there. And then we'll go back to 32. Verse 43. Vayar Moshe es kol hamlacha, v'hinei asu osa ka'asher tiva Hashem kein asu vayivarech osa Moshe. And Moses saw all of the work, all the construction, and behold, they had done it as God commanded, so did they, and Moses blessed them. Now, we'll turn back to Genesis 1, and that'll be in the single digits. Verse 31, Exodus 1:31. Vayar Elokim et kol asher asa, and God saw all that he had done, all that he had made, and behold, v'hinei, tov me'od, it was very good. Again, verse 43, Vayar Moshe et kol hamlacha v'hinei asu osa, and Moses saw all of the work, and behold, v'hinei, asu, it was done as God commanded. Okay. Now, chapter 2, verse 1. Let's verse 3. Vayivarech Elokim, and God blessed the seventh day. Vayikadesh oto, and made and sanctified it. Going back to verse 43. Vayivarech osam Moshe, and Moses blessed them. Verse 1. Let's go to Exodus 2:1. Vayechulu hashamayim v'ha'aretz v'chol tzva'am, and the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their hosts. Vayechal Elokim, and God finished. Melachto, melacha. There's the word melacha. His work, his construction that he had done, asher asa. And then here, now we go back to verse Exodus 39:32. Vatechel, same root, at kol avodat mishkan, or el moed. Also, another reference of the same word, and here it's more clear. Um, Here, page 390, chapter 40, verse 33.
33. Lakem?
Vayechal, or vayakem es hachatzer saviv, lamishkan v'lamizbeach, and he erected the courtyard around the tabernacle and the altar. Vayitain es masach shar hachatzer, and he put up the curtain, the screen of the gate of the court. Vayechal Moshe es hamelacha. And there we have those words again, Vayechal and Milacha. He concluded, completed, finished Milacha, creation, construction work. And so the work of God in creation is left unsanctified until the seventh day, which God sanctifies, and there God finished the work and sanctified it. And then we have a mirroring of the same idea in which people go through their work, and we work to make a sacred space for God, and when it's finished, it has blessing. So now, to your earlier question, Professor, about the blessings in the Torah for people who fulfill God's will. The way I understand it is to say that rather than looking at it as a tit for tat, but to say that things running as they should is a manifestation of everything being in its place. And that is to say that if you will do that which you should, if you will be in the correct place for you, then things will run as they should. And the universe will be able to go on track. And that is then the blessing. The conduits are open. The channels are free. And things can flow as they should. Consciousness flows, and relationships flow, and the work is unobstructed, and our interconnectedness of the physical and the spiritual are in harmony and in peace and in the right relationship.
What, in the Garden of Eden, what did God, if anything, require of Adam and Eve? I know they shouldn't eat, they could eat stuff, they shouldn't eat certain stuff. Were they supposed to be take care of the animals?
So the Torah says
Things were simpler then.
they were.
They were in 613.
So the Torah says that they were placed in the garden to work it and to guard it.
Uh-huh.
And so the rabbis understand to work it and to guard it to be a reference to the thou shalts, which is to work, and to guard is the thou shalt nots. Now, the only explicit mitzvah that they had was don't eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And actually, been doing some work on that subject with the Jewish Learning Institute. So I'm sitting on the rabbinic advisory board with the curriculum development team, and we're working on an upcoming course to be talking about that topic, about the story of the of Adam and Eve and the tree of knowledge, and fascinating stuff. We're really going to be digging into it, peeling away the layers. So in a sense, you could say that they had a positive commandment to eat from all the other trees, and a negative, thou shalt not to eat from the tree of knowledge, good and evil. And what that means, well, that's for a whole nother discussion. You have to stay tuned.
So are you guys the new Talmud, the new chapter added on to the Talmud?
That's an excellent point.
JLI people?
The JLI, is that a new Talmud? You know, the Jewish teaching has always been understood to be an oral tradition. And, we have the written Torah, but the word Torah means teaching, not Bible, right? So even though the Talmud is a recording of some of that oral tradition, the way it works, and the way it's always worked, is through discussion, and there is an ongoing project to analyze, apply, and I don't want to use the word interpret, but to analyze, to apply, and to integrate the teachings of the oral tradition. Bring into focus different parts. So this work is a continuation of what the Talmud was doing, and Torah therefore exists most precisely in the space between teacher and student, not in a book. So that's where the tradition lives. So there is this idea of taking traditional Jewish teaching and applying it and reanalyzing it and rewriting it is
seeing how it applies to conditions in modern times.
Right. So that is the same of what we've always been doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And whether to call it the next chapter in the Talmud is we just don't do that. We have a Talmud already. And
right.
We're continuing.
So the law of Talmud is considered binding on all the Jewish community. It's been accepted. Sort of the Talmud. So there's a paradox, right? On the one hand, the Talmud was canonized, and it's static in that sense, that it doesn't. It's been accepted as a closed work, and all the decisions in the Talmud are considered binding on the Jewish community.
Whatever decisions there are.
If there be any concrete decisions in the Talmud, but there are, and there's also a methodology to understanding how to reach a conclusion in a text that looks like it's full of dispute. Meaning, there is a tradition about how to resolve, the Talmud says this rabbi says this and that rabbi says this, and it seems like it's unresolved, but the tradition will often tell us a clear direction as to what is meant about who you're supposed to follow, by the order of how it's written, or by the individual names that are mentioned. There's a tradition around that.
But isn't there another point in halacha that sometimes it can be a bit stretched and applied according how people see it, and situations and times and problems that they can adjust to it?
So I wouldn't say stretched.
Okay, maybe it's not the correct word.
Interpreted.
Adjusted, interpreted,
Applied.
applied.
Yeah.
You're the
So,
professionals.
so
Interpretation.
so I think that, but you understand the distinction that I'm making between interpreted, stretched, and applied.
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely. Stretch would be perhaps too much. Applied is under certain conditions and timing
Right.
and the people
Right.
involved.
So the body of Jewish tradition that we call with a catch-all the Torah has um, seems like a monolith, like one entity, but actually it contains with it a complex, multi-layered. It's a multi-layered body with different aspects to it. So we have accepted Jewish tradition uh, that's regarded as biblical law. We have um, applications of that tradition to new circumstances and new situations. So it may not be explicit in the law, but we apply it to a new situation. So, for example, the Torah says, "You shall not um, write on the Sabbath." And the question is, can you take a photograph on the Sabbath? Okay, so is that considered writing? So that
Can
you would be
press a computer key?
compressing a computer key. So I wanted to avoid let's say typing on a screen, right? Is typing on a screen considered writing? So this here you're taking something which is a clearly established quote unquote biblical law in the sense that it's unilaterally accepted, unanimously accepted across the Jewish community as the authentic Jewish tradition, and now we have a new circumstance, and so we're applying that new circumstance to this established tradition. Then we have, so that's two layers now. You have the original text, the original statement, and then you have the new application of the original statement. Then you have another layer, which is rabbinic enactments. So laws enacted by the rabbinic community throughout the ages in order to protect, to make a quote a fence around the Torah, to protect us or to reinforce the practice of the Torah. So an example of that might be that um, we don't eat. Let's see an example.
I have an example.
Yeah.
On Saturday night in the summers, many rabbis have decided not to make weddings.
Okay, so that is, so that's the next layer. So I'm going to go to the first layer. An example of that is on the Sabbath it's forbidden to write. We said, so there's a rabbinic enactment which says it's also forbidden to handle a pen. Right. So that's an example of a rabbinic enactment, and that is and that's in the Talmud, and that's accepted across the entire Jewish community, right? Muktzah.
And forbidden to write. That's another
The prohibition against writing is biblical.
Is biblical.
Is biblical, meaning it's not written in the text, but it's the it is.
It was just a prohibition to do work.
So the work. That's why the word melacha I translated as creation, construction. Right, because it's not about the labor, it's about the transformative quality of what's being done.
But in the Bible they just said they didn't actually, or did they? Was there explicit?
So no, it says lo ta'aseh melacha, don't no. So that's why I said biblical law in quotations, because it's referred to in our tradition as biblical law, even though it's not written in the text explicitly, because it is referenced to. Our tradition says that the word do not do any melacha, do not do any intentional, creative, constructive activity on Shabbos is referring to, for example, not writing. So the biblical text, and this is sort of a understanding that this is directly from God through Moses. It's the skeleton of the law, right? And it's fundamental. It's the foundation of the law. So that's referred to as biblical law, right? And then you have a new application of that, which would be perhaps taking a photograph with film, in which it's new technology, but we could apply the same principle and say that you are creating an image on something, and so therefore that would be a rabbinical understanding that this is a would be an application of that biblical principle. Then there is the additional rabbinic enactment on top of that, which says that the rabbinical community has required that we refrain from handling a pen or a camera because that's a rabbinical. Nobody claims that that's part of the original tradition. That was an addition by the rabbis in order to reinforce the practice of refraining from writing on the Sabbath, right? And then you'll have on top of that, you have the individual communities may take on specific customs that are particular to them, and that's something that each of us can do. And so, for example, the reason why we don't perform weddings on the Sabbath itself is, and this is, by the way, a rabbinic enactment also, we don't perform weddings on the Sabbath because a wedding usually involves writing. And so the writing of the ketubah, the signing of the marriage documents, and therefore we don't perform a wedding ceremony on the Sabbath. So that would be a rabbinic enactment in order to reinforce, to protect, so as not to come to violate the Sabbath. And then you have in some communities, they've made a rule where they wouldn't perform weddings on Saturday night so that people wouldn't be doing, especially in the summer where it's a short Saturday night, so that people wouldn't come to cook on the Sabbath or to do all those kinds of things, right? Pictures, photographs, beauty parlor, right?
Prepare and cook.
Right.
This is where the word
Minhag means custom, right?
minhag.
Yeah. Yeah, or in Yiddish minhag, yeah.
Minhag, I see.
Yeah. So another example of that would be even taking it a step further, that a rabbinic community might say, we will revoke the kosher, this is controversial, we'll revoke the kosher certification of an establishment that allows a wedding after the Sabbath. Because it's kind of leverage, right? Huh? Or I'll give you an example of when that's done. I'll give you an example of that.
By example, not by threats.
Bread that's made with milk. So the Shulchan Aruch says that bread made with milk must be discernibly different than ordinary bread, because people often eat bread with meat, right? And since we don't eat milk and meat together, right? Now, what happens when you have Wonder Bread, which has milk in it? I don't know if it still does, but for a point in time, much of the bread made in America had milk in it. If it doesn't, and if it's not discernibly different,
You don't know.
can you put a kosher certification on that bread?
No.
Right? So it doesn't follow it's kosher, but it doesn't follow the rabbinic practice that we've been taught, and therefore they could not put the kosher certification on. You'll say that there's a marking on the package, but the practice is it's got to be marking on the bread itself.
I just learned this in the OU's kosher currents last issue.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Right? And it was a big problem, actually, because I think it was very hard to find kosher certified bread that was mass-produced. Yeah. And I think only recently, I think they found some resolution to this issue. But I mean, we don't eat mass-produced bread, so I'm not really familiar with this issue. But apparently, it was a real problem. All right, so I just want to conclude now. Back to where we were about carving out space for the divine, carving out space for the sacred in our lives. And there's a couple of things about the Mishkan that that teach us how we can carve out space for the divine. First of all, the idea of rules. The Mishkan is replete, the building of the Mishkan is replete with specific details and regulations about how the Mishkan should be built. And normally we think about the sacred as being transcendent, but in the Jewish idea of how to access the transcendent and the sacred, it has to be through the human experience and not disconnected from, but about creating harmony and balance between the human experience and the spiritual, and therefore it must be manifest in the specificity of the human experience. And so we normally think about in Western spirituality about kind of, however you access God is fine. But in Jewish teaching, we're saying that actually the manifestation, the expression of the divine being in these details is a more fulsome, creates a more fulsome relationship with God. And so this is number one, is that the regulations and the rules and the specific times and the specific amounts and shapes and places. And so to our case, I would say, for example, identifying the unique places and unique times where we are focused on the divine, on the sacred. The start of Shabbos, being mindful of the exact moment on the clock that the sun sets on Friday evening. That exact moment that the sun sets, that specific moment, is the hallmark of the human experience. Again, that's specificity. And saying, now it's the seventh day, and now it's the Sabbath, is marking and carving out that awareness of the divine as being something that is focused and embraced by the human experience and in the human experience. Another example of that is the entering the synagogue. We say Ma Tovu, right? This prayer that we say when we enter the synagogue. Ma Tovu aholecha Yaakov mishkenosecha Yisrael v'ani b'rov chasdecha avo beisecha. And I, by your great mercy, enter your house. And so that awareness that as we enter the synagogue, as we enter the sanctuary, we are entering a space that is designated, right, a holy place, and that helps us to be aware of how everything fits in, right? As we said, it's about identifying the puzzle piece, right? But it's marking that space, the moment of prayer, pausing for a moment before praying, to carve out mental space in our mind and in our thoughts, in our presence, in our sense of being in focus, to say, this moment is going to be now a moment of prayer. I'm going to carve it out. Then the idea of time and repetition. The rabbis tell us that referred to in the text over here, in the biblical text in the last chapter of Exodus, that Moshe erected the Mishkan and he put it together. And this idea that carving out sacred space will require a step-by-step process, will require work, doesn't happen in a moment. It doesn't happen in one day. If it happens immediately, then it isn't of the human experience, it's disconnected, it's disintegrated from the human experience. And so it being in a step-by-step process, in an organic, growing step process, is representative of the fact that it's going to be integrated into my experience, integrated into that my puzzle piece is fully manifest. But then, at the same time, there is verse 35, which is mind-blowing. We said, Vayechal Moshe, and Moshe finished the work. And then we say, V'lo yachol Moshe. Verse 35. And Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had descended upon it.
I wonder why What, was he thinking of going in?
Well, it's a house of worship.
I mean, not only was he not, nobody would go in.
But I want to first note the similarity in the text between vayachal and velo yachol. Yachol and yachal. Right? Vayachal means and he finished. Yachol means and he was able. But here he was not able to enter the tabernacle. And so I think it reminds us that even as, and this is I think a very important aspect to this whole thing, and that the professor alluded to earlier, even as we carve out space for God in our world, we have to remember that it's not us. That ultimately there is something larger than us. There's something greater than us. There's something beyond our experience that we're connecting to through our experience. And this is, I think, the key to the whole thing. Is we have this is the Achilles heel of this approach, is that connecting to God through the specific dimensions of the human experience has the vulnerability of becoming something that we own, and then we think that we can then go and modify it, because the Jewish tradition, as I said, the Jewish tradition has been in the hands of the rabbinical community, and it exists in the space between teacher and student. And so we say, well, rabbis have talked about doing this, and rabbis have talked about doing that, so I'm going to talk about doing something different, right? And here's how I connect to this tradition that my ancestors did. And so by it becoming something of the human experience, we say, well, my experience is different, so I'm going to mess with it. We're going to have whatever. We won't go into whatever fad. Every generation and every season has its own fad and its own reimagining and reinterpretation of Jewish tradition. So there's a sweet spot of being, on the one hand, connected to the human experience, integrated with what it is to be a human being in God's world, while at the same time recognizing this is not about me, this is about the presence of God, which I don't own, which I can't confine, which I can't, which I'm only trying to touch through my experience, but that I don't get to define by my experience. Okay?
It's above and beyond me.
Mm-hmm.
It's something supernatural
That
is beyond my understanding.
So it's above and beyond me, but I reach it through me.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay.
Fine line there between how creative I can be,
Right.
with respect to the tradition.
Right. So I have to be integrated. It has to be real.
Megillah and hip hop.
Right. Can we do Megillah and hip hop? That's a great example of that.
A musical style.
Better you should know.
Musical style.
Yeah. Yeah. It's otherwise known. Another generation would know it as rap.
Okay.
And I know the Mevinim, the experts will split hairs. Is there a difference between rap and hip hop?
Yeah,
Okay,
it's
fine.
all crap.
Hey, don't
I'm
mess.
Old school.
Don't mess. Old school is a hip hop term. Just saying.
As in 50s, 60s, 70s music.
Okay. Wishing everyone a happy Adar. And a good Chodesh. Tonight is Rosh Chodesh. Tonight, tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh.
And maybe some Rosh Chodesh.